Adrian Wentworth, Duke of Ashcombe, stood on the front steps of the manor his family had held for 6 generations and watched workmen carry the last of the good furniture out into waiting carts. It was a grey morning, the kind that seemed to press the whole sky down flat against the fields, and the estate spread before him in every direction looked exactly as tired and grey as he felt. Somewhere beyond the immediate bustle of departing furniture, a dog barked at nothing in particular, and a cartwheel creaked over the gravel drive with a sound that struck Adrian, in that moment, as unbearably final. "The Wentworth desk, Your Grace," said his steward, a thin, anxious man named Collins, hovering at his elbow with a ledger clutched to his chest like armor. "Shall it go with the rest, or would you prefer it held back for the new owner's consideration?" "Sell everything, Collins. There is no sense keeping furniture for a house I no longer own." He had made the decision 3 days before, after a final and thoroughly humiliating meeting with his bankers in London, and had not permitted himself to reconsider it since. The numbers, when laid out plainly across a solicitor's desk, admitted no other conclusion. His father had left behind debts stretching back nearly a decade, tenant farms so neglected they yielded barely enough to feed the families working them, a manor roof that leaked in 11 separate places, and a reputation among the county's other landowners for presiding over the most visibly declining estate in 3 shires. He had sat in that London office listening to figures recited in the flat, unsentimental voice bankers reserved for matters they had long since ceased to find remarkable, and had understood, with a clarity that still sat cold in his chest, that there was no version of prudent management that could save Ashcombe from the consequences of a decade's accumulated neglect. He looked out across the western fields, where the grass grew in patches, yellow and thin, between stretches of bare cracked earth. Even a man with no particular knowledge of farming could see that something was deeply wrong with land that ought, by every account he'd read of the estate's history, to have been among the most productive in the county. "There is no saving it," Collins said, not unkindly, following his gaze. "Mr. Harcourt has said as much a dozen times, Your Grace, and he has managed this land longer than either of us has been alive. Best to sell while there is still something left to sell." Adrian said nothing, for he had no argument to offer against a conclusion he had already reached himself. He was still standing there, silent and grim, when a young woman crossed the drive toward the house, plainly dressed, a basket over one arm, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone entirely accustomed to walking these grounds. She stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to have clearly overheard the conversation, and regarded him with an expression that held none of the deference he was accustomed to receiving from his tenants. "Forgive me for intruding, Your Grace," she said, "but I could not help overhearing. You're not selling worthless land. You're selling land you never learned how to use." Adrian turned to look at her fully for the first time, startled less by the sentiment than by the sheer audacity of a farmer's daughter addressing a duke in such terms. "I beg your pardon." "I said you're not selling worthless land," she repeated, entirely unbothered by his tone. "I've walked these fields my whole life, Your Grace. I know what's wrong with them. And it isn't what your Mr. Harcourt has told you." "And you are?" Adrian asked, once he had recovered sufficiently from the surprise of being addressed so plainly. "Eliza Bennet, Your Grace. My father is Thomas Bennet. He farmed the land along the western boundary until it was let go some years back. I grew up working that soil alongside him." "Then you will understand, Miss Bennet, that the decision to sell Ashcombe has already been made, and was not reached lightly. My advisers have examined every possibility." "Have they walked the land themselves, Your Grace? Or only read the reports Mr. Harcourt provides them?" The question landed with more force than Adrian expected, for the honest answer was that he had walked precious little of his own estate since inheriting it, preferring the relative comfort of ledgers and reports to the mud and difficulty of the fields themselves. He had trusted Harcourt's assessments the way he trusted most things presented to him by men in positions of established authority, without particular scrutiny, and without the time or inclination to verify them personally. "You are very bold, Miss Bennet, for a tenant farmer's daughter." "I have very little to lose by speaking honestly, Your Grace, and rather a great deal to lose by staying silent while land that could feed half this county is sold off to whoever offers the highest price for it. She adjusted the basket on her arm, unhurried, entirely unintimidated by his title or his evident displeasure. The western fields fail because the old drainage channels have been blocked for years, not because the soil itself is poor. There's a spring near the abandoned orchard that could water twice the acreage currently under cultivation, if anyone troubled themselves to find it. I don't say this to contradict your advisers for the pleasure of it, Your Grace. I say it because I have watched good land go to waste for want of anyone willing to look at it properly. And how would you know any of this, precisely? My father worked those fields before they were abandoned, Your Grace. He taught me everything he knew of soil and water and crops, because he had no son to teach it to, and because he believed knowledge oughtn't go to waste simply for want of the proper person to receive it. Something flickered in her expression, pride, perhaps, or a defensiveness born of long practice defending her own competence. I do not ask you to take my word for it. I ask only that you look yourself, before you sign away land that has fed this family's tenants for 6 generations. Adrian studied her a long moment, torn between the dismissive skepticism his position generally afforded him and a curiosity he could not entirely suppress. There was something in her bearing, not deference, exactly, but a kind of unshakable practical confidence, that reminded him, uncomfortably, of qualities he had once possessed himself, before years of debt and disappointment had worn them steadily away. Prove it, he said finally. Show me this spring, and this drainage system you speak of. If you are right, Miss Bennet, I will consider what it means for the estate's future. If you are wrong, I will have wasted an afternoon I can ill afford to lose. Then let us not waste it standing here talking, Your Grace. She led him first to the old drainage channels, cut generations before along the lowest edge of the western fields, now so thoroughly overgrown and silted that Adrian would have walked directly past them without recognizing their purpose at all. Eliza knelt at the edge of one, clearing away a season's worth of fallen leaves and matted grass with her bare hands, revealing beneath it stonework laid with obvious care and skill, blocked entirely by decades of accumulated debris. Your grandfather's steward had these channels cut, Your Grace, according to my father. They carried excess water away from the low fields during the wet months, and fed it back during dry ones through a system of sluices further down the slope. When they blocked, through neglect, mostly, though I suspect some of it was deliberate, the low fields began to flood every spring and dry to cracked earth every summer. No crop can thrive under those conditions, however good the soil beneath it. Deliberate neglect. That is a serious accusation, Miss Bennet. I make no accusation I cannot support, Your Grace. I only observe that a man paid to manage an estate's land ought to have noticed blocked drainage channels sooner than 8 years, if he were looking closely at all. Adrian said nothing to this, filing the observation away with rather more unease than he cared to admit, and followed her further along the boundary of the estate to a stretch of overgrown woodland he had scarcely set foot in since childhood. There, Eliza said, pointing toward a low, mossy hollow half hidden beneath a tangle of hawthorn. The spring my father spoke of. It runs year-round, even in the driest summers. I have seen it myself, more times than I can count, when I came here as a girl to fetch water for our own kitchen garden. Adrian knelt and found, beneath the tangle of growth, a clear and steady trickle of water emerging from the hillside exactly as she had described, cold and clean against his fingers when he tested it. He sat back on his heels, turning the discovery over with a mixture of surprise and a slowly dawning, uncomfortable suspicion. Harcourt never mentioned either of these things to me. Perhaps he did not know of them, Your Grace. Eliza's tone suggested she did not believe this explanation herself, though she offered it without particular malice. Or perhaps he had his own reasons for allowing you to believe the land beyond saving. They cleared a small section of the drainage channel together that same afternoon, working in a silence that gradually grew less awkward as the physical labor absorbed them both, and Adrian found himself, by the time the light began to fail, covered in mud in a manner no duke of his acquaintance would ever have permitted himself, and strangely, unexpectedly satisfied by the accomplishment of it. "We will need weeks to clear the whole system properly," Eliza said, surveying their modest progress with a critical eye. "But even this much ought to show some improvement by spring, if the winter rains behave themselves." "You speak with considerable confidence for someone proposing to reverse 8 years of neglect with a single afternoon's labor." "I speak with the confidence of someone who has watched this land recover from worse, Your Grace, given half a chance." She straightened, brushing dirt from her skirts with brisk efficiency. "The question is not whether the land can recover. The question is whether you are willing to give it the chance before you sign the papers that end any possibility of finding out." Adrian did not sell Ashcombe that week, though he told himself, in the days that followed, that the delay reflected nothing more than prudent caution rather than any genuine reconsideration of his decision. He summoned Harcourt to discuss the drainage channels and the spring, watching the man's reaction with a scrutiny he had not previously thought to apply to his own estate manager. Harcourt's explanation, that the channels had simply been overlooked amid more pressing concerns, and that he had never heard mention of any spring near the old orchard, struck Adrian, upon reflection, as somewhat too smooth, too readily supplied, for a man who claimed to know every corner of the estate intimately. "I would like to test a section of the western fields," Adrian told him, using the girl's suggestions regarding the drainage and irrigation. "With respect, Your Grace, I would advise against wasting further resources on land I have already assessed as unproductive. A farmer's daughter, however well-intentioned, is hardly qualified to overturn years of professional management. The resources required for a small test are minimal, Harcourt, and I find myself curious to see the result regardless of your reservations." Harcourt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he offered no further argument, and Adrian allotted a modest section of the western fields, no more than 3 acres, small enough that failure would cost the estate little, for Eliza's proposed improvements. The work, once properly organized, proceeded with a speed and efficiency that surprised him. Eliza recruited several of the estate's own tenants, men who had farmed the land for decades and understood its particular difficulties better than any London-trained agent ever could, and together they cleared the drainage channels fully, diverted a portion of the spring's flow toward the driest section of the test field, and prepared the soil according to methods Eliza's father had practiced for years on his own small holding. "Rotation matters as much as water," Eliza explained to Adrian one afternoon, walking the boundary of the test field with him as autumn settled properly over the estate. "Your previous manager planted the same crop in the same fields year after year, exhausting the soil entirely. My father always rotated, wheat, then clover to restore what the wheat had taken, then wheat again. It seems a small thing, but the difference in yield is considerable. You speak of my father's management with rather more diplomacy than I generally manage myself. Your father is not the one standing before me, Your Grace, and it seemed unkind to speak ill of a man I never knew." She glanced at him, something almost like amusement flickering across her expression. "Though I confess I have formed some opinions of Mr. Harcourt that I have kept rather more carefully to myself. You may share them, if you wish." "Not yet," she said. "Suspicion is not proof, and I would rather show you results than accusations." The first harvest from the test field, when it came in that autumn, exceeded every expectation Adrian had permitted himself to hold. Where the surrounding unimproved fields had yielded barely enough grain to justify the labor of planting them, the small 3-acre test produced a harvest so much richer that even the estate's most skeptical tenants gathered to see it for themselves, murmuring among each other with an interest Adrian had not witnessed directed toward Ashcombe's fields in years. "For the first time in longer than I can remember," Collins told him, reviewing the figures with visible astonishment, "this section of the estate has turned a genuine profit, Your Grace." The success of the test field changed the character of the estate almost immediately. Where before the tenants had approached Adrian with the wary resignation of people long accustomed to disappointment, now they began arriving at the manor with questions, suggestions, and a cautious, tentative hope that Adrian found himself unexpectedly moved by. He expanded the improvements across a larger section of the western fields that winter, working closely with Eliza and her father to plan the rotation and irrigation properly, and found himself, more often than not, seeking her counsel on matters well beyond the strict question of farming. Which tenant families most urgently needed assistance, which of the estate's neglected buildings ought to be repaired first, how best to organize the labor of clearing the remaining drainage channels before the spring rains arrived in earnest. "You spend a great deal of time in Miss Bennet's company, Your Grace," Harcourt observed one evening, with a carefully measured neutrality that did not entirely disguise his displeasure. "I spend time where the estate's interests require it, Harcourt. Miss Bennet's knowledge has proven considerably more valuable than I initially credited." "Of course, Your Grace. Though I would gently observe that a farmer's daughter, however knowledgeable of soil and crops, cannot fully appreciate the broader financial pressures facing an estate such as Ashcombe. There is a great deal beyond mere agriculture that determines whether a property such as this can ultimately be saved." Adrian found the remark oddly unsettling, though he could not immediately articulate why, and it was only some weeks later, reviewing the estate's timber accounts with rather more attention than he had previously applied to them, that the unease began to sharpen into genuine suspicion. The figures did not add well. Timber that ought, by any reasonable market price, to have fetched a considerable sum had been sold, according to Harcourt's own records, for a fraction of its evident value, and the buyers listed, a handful of names Adrian did not recognize, operating through intermediary agents rather than directly, struck him, upon closer examination, as unusually consistent in their dealings with the estate over a period of several years. He mentioned the discrepancy to Eliza one grey afternoon, walking the boundary of the newly recovered orchard, where the first pruned and cleared trees were beginning, tentatively, to show signs of renewed health. "I have wondered about the timber sales myself," she admitted. "My father mentioned, more than once, that the prices seemed low for wood of that quality. But it is not my place to accuse a duke's own steward of dishonesty without proof, Your Grace, however much I might suspect it privately." "You suspected this, and said nothing." "I suspected it, and had no evidence beyond an old farmer's grumbling, which is not the sort of thing one brings before a duke without considerable caution." She looked at him steadily. "I did not wish you to think I approached you with accusations meant to serve my own advantage, Your Grace. I wished you to see the truth of the land for yourself first, and draw whatever further conclusions the evidence supported." Adrian found himself, in that moment, admiring her restraint rather more than he resented her silence. A woman who might easily have used suspicion as a weapon to further ingratiate herself, and had chosen instead the more difficult, more honest path of letting results speak before accusations did. Their working partnership deepened over the following months into something Adrian found himself, with some private astonishment, looking forward to rather than merely tolerating. He began seeking her opinion on matters he would previously have settled entirely alone, walking the fields with her in the early mornings before the day's formal business claimed his attention, and discovered, gradually, that their conversations ranged well beyond the strict business of farming into subjects he had not discussed openly with anyone in years: his father's difficult final years, the weight of responsibility he had inherited alongside the title, the particular loneliness of a position that afforded him every material comfort while denying him, almost entirely, anyone who spoke to him honestly rather than deferentially. "You are not at all what I expected when I first spoke to you outside the manor," Eliza told him one evening, as they walked back from the fields together in the fading autumn light. "And what did you expect, precisely?" "A man too proud to hear anything he did not wish to hear. I have known men of your class before, Your Grace, not personally, perhaps, but by reputation, and by the way they treat those beneath them. I expected to be dismissed, or worse, mocked for my presumption." "I confess I nearly did dismiss you," he admitted. "Pride is not so easily set aside as I might wish." "And yet you listened." "I listened," he agreed, "because you were right, and because some part of me recognized it even before I had proof enough to justify the recognition." He glanced at her, something unfamiliar and rather unsettling stirring in his chest. "You have given me back an estate I believed entirely lost, Eliza." I do not know how a duke properly thanks a farmer's daughter for such a gift. You need not thank me at all, your grace. I did not do it for gratitude. She held his gaze a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. I did it because I could not bear to watch good land wasted for want of anyone willing to see its worth. There were smaller moments, too, that accumulated between them without either quite acknowledging their weight at the time. Adrian found her one wet afternoon sitting with an elderly tenant whose husband had recently died, listening patiently to the woman's worries about the coming winter with a gentleness that owed nothing to any obligation of estate management, and retreated quietly rather than intrude upon a kindness she had clearly not meant for any audience. Eliza, in turn, discovered him one evening reviewing tenant petitions by candlelight long after Collins had retired for the night, correcting an unfair rent assessment with the same careful attention he might once have reserved for far grander matters of state, and found herself moved by the sight in a way she had not expected to be moved by a duke's paperwork. Eliza, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn to the man beneath the duke's careful composure, the genuine grief he carried for a father whose failures had nearly cost the family everything, the quiet determination with which he had thrown himself into the estate's recovery once he finally believed it possible, the particular gentleness with which he had begun, in recent weeks, addressing the estate's struggling tenants, no longer as distant obligations but as people whose well-being genuinely concerned him. She saw, too, the loneliness beneath his pride, a man who had spent years managing an impossible inheritance largely alone, surrounded by advisers who offered calculations rather than genuine counsel, and she found herself wishing, against every sensible instinct her circumstances ought to have counselled, that the growing warmth between them might be permitted to become something more than mere professional partnership. Neither spoke of it directly, that autumn, though both understood, in the careful, unhurried way that honest people often understand such things, that something considerably deeper than gratitude had begun to grow between them. Harcourt watched the estate's gradual recovery with an alarm he took increasing care to conceal, though the strain of that concealment grew more visible with every passing month. He had built, over the better part of a decade, a careful and profitable arrangement, allowing sections of the estate to deteriorate through calculated neglect, undervaluing timber and produce sold through intermediaries who returned him a private commission, and steadily accumulating, through a network of agents that traced back, though carefully obscured, to his own family's interests, informal claims on portions of Ashcombe land that would become formally purchasable the moment the estate was, finally, inevitably sold. Eliza's improvements threatened the entire scheme. If Ashcombe recovered its profitability, the pressure that had driven Adrian towards selling would evaporate entirely, and years of careful, patient manipulation would collapse to nothing. He began, in small and deniable ways, to work against her. He discouraged tenants from cooperating with the improvement projects, suggesting privately that Eliza's ambitions extended well beyond mere farming advice, that she sought, through her growing influence with the Duke, some advantage for herself and her father that ordinary tenants would never share in. The whispers spread slowly at first, then with gathering speed, until Eliza began to notice a new wariness among some of the very families she had worked hardest to help. "They say you mean to become more important than His Grace himself," her father told her one evening, worry etched plainly across his weathered face. "I have told them it is nonsense, Eliza, but the talk troubles me all the same. A duke does not take farming advice from a farmer's daughter without eventually wanting something in return, and men begin to wonder what that something might be. I want nothing from him beyond what I have already given, father, a fair chance for this land, and for the people who depend upon it. I know that, child. I only fear that not everyone shares my certainty, and that certain men find it convenient to encourage the doubt." Eliza said nothing of this conversation to Adrian, unwilling to burden him with suspicions she could not yet prove, though the growing wariness among some of the tenants troubled her considerably more than she allowed herself to admit even to her own father. Harcourt, meanwhile, began quietly assembling the materials for a rather more direct assault. Forged correspondence suggesting Eliza had been diverting estate funds toward her own family's benefit, carefully constructed to withstand casual scrutiny, and timed, he calculated, to strike precisely when the Duke's growing trust in her had reached its most vulnerable point. It was Eliza herself, searching through an old estate office for records of the original drainage system's construction, who discovered the evidence that would ultimately unravel Harcourt's entire scheme. The room had been locked and largely forgotten for years, its key mislaid somewhere among the estate's disorganized effects, and Eliza gained entry only after Collins, in the course of a broader search for old survey maps, happened upon the key tucked inside a long-neglected desk drawer. Inside, among decades of accumulated papers, she found an old ledger belonging to Adrian's grandfather, its pages filled with careful, precise notations regarding the estate's most valuable and productive sections. Records showing that the very fields Harcourt had long dismissed as worthless had, 2 generations before, been deliberately protected from development specifically because of their exceptional agricultural value. The fertile soil along the western boundary, the reliable spring near. The old orchard, a stand of rare and valuable timber the elder Duke had explicitly forbidden anyone to harvest for short-term profit. More troubling still, tucked among the ledger's pages, she found correspondence between Adrian's grandfather and a Harcourt ancestor, an early estate agent whose family had apparently served Ashcombe for generations, expressing considerable frustration at the man's repeated attempts to undervalue and quietly acquire portions of the estate's most valuable land through intermediary purchases. The old Duke's suspicions, it seemed, had been dismissed at the time as unfounded jealousy between neighboring families, and the matter had faded from memory long before Adrian's own father inherited the title. Eliza brought the ledger to Adrian immediately, her hands trembling slightly with the significance of what she had found. "Your Grace, I believe this explains a great deal that has puzzled us both." Adrian read through the relevant pages with growing, cold clarity, understanding at last the full and patient shape of the scheme that had been operating against his family's interests for considerably longer than his own brief tenure as Duke. "Harcourt's family has coveted this land for generations." "It would seem so, Your Grace. And I suspect the current Mr. Harcourt has simply continued a pattern his own ancestors began, waiting patiently for an opportunity your father's difficulties finally provided." Adrian sat with the ledger a long while, the full weight of the deception settling over him. "I trusted him with everything, Eliza. My father trusted him before me. And all the while he was quietly steering this estate toward exactly the ruin that would finally let his family claim what mine had refused to sell for generations." "You could not have known, Your Grace. Trust is not foolishness merely because it was misplaced." "Perhaps not. But I intend to see it corrected all the same." Harcourt struck before Adrian could act fully on the ledger's revelations, sensing, with the instinct of a man who had spent years reading the currents of power and suspicion within the estate, that his time had grown dangerously short. He came to Adrian directly, his manner grave and apparently reluctant, carrying with him a small collection of documents he claimed, with considerable performed sorrow, to have discovered quite by accident while reviewing the estate's financial records. "I take no pleasure in bringing this to you, Your Grace," he said, laying the papers before Adrian with careful deliberation. "But I could not, in good conscience, allow you to remain ignorant of what I have found. Miss Bennet, it appears, has been diverting a portion of the estate's improvement funds toward her own family's benefit, payments to her father's holding disguised as legitimate estate expenses, extending back several months." Adrian examined the documents with a sinking unease he had not expected to feel so completely, for the forgeries, whatever their ultimate falseness, had been constructed with genuine skill, mimicking Eliza's handwriting and the estate's own record-keeping conventions closely enough to withstand casual inspection. "These are serious accusations, Harcourt. I would not bring them before you without genuine cause, Your Grace. I understand Miss Bennet has earned your trust these past months. It grieves me considerably to be the one to complicate that trust." For a brief, agonizing moment, doubt crept into Adrian's certainty, not because he genuinely believed Eliza capable of such deception, but because the careful, patient construction of Harcourt's accusation exploited precisely the insecurity a proud man in his position could not entirely escape, the fear that his own judgment, so recently and so thoroughly humbled by the discovery of his manager's true nature, might have failed him equally in trusting the young woman who had done so much to save his estate. He confronted Eliza that same evening, the forged documents laid between them, his manner cold and guarded in a way that struck her immediately as a painful echo of their very first conversation, months before. "Explain these, if you can." Eliza studied the papers with growing horror and disbelief. "These are false, Your Grace. Every figure, every signature. I have never seen these documents before in my life, and I have certainly never diverted a single shilling from this estate toward any purpose beyond its own recovery." "They bear your hand, Eliza, or something remarkably close to it. Then someone has forged them with considerable skill, because I assure you, on my father's life, that I am entirely innocent of what you are accusing me." Her voice, usually so composed, cracked with a hurt that struck him more deeply than he expected. "I never wanted your money, Your Grace. I only wanted you to stop destroying something that could have fed hundreds of people. If that counts for nothing against a stranger's forged papers, then I do not know what more I could ever have done to earn your trust. I have given you months of honest labor, months of honest counsel, and watched you build back an estate I feared would be lost entirely to strangers, and it seems that counts for less, in the end, than a piece of paper with my name forged upon it." "Eliza." "No, Your Grace. I think I have said what needs saying." She gathered herself with visible effort, though her hands still trembled. "I will not stand here and beg you to believe me over a stack of papers you have not even troubled to examine properly. If your trust is so easily shaken, then perhaps it was never the trust one believed it to be." She left Ashcombe that same night, unwilling to remain where her honesty had been so readily doubted, and Adrian, torn between lingering suspicion and a growing, unwelcome certainty that he had made a grave and possibly unforgivable error, did not stop her. The estate's recovery, so promising through the preceding months, began faltering almost immediately in Eliza's absence. Small problems that she had managed instinctively, the timing of the winter pruning, the proper rotation of the newly recovered fields, the careful negotiation of disputes among tenants unaccustomed to working cooperatively, accumulated steadily into larger difficulties that Adrian, for all his improved understanding of the estate's needs, found himself unable to manage alone with anything like a practiced skill. He threw himself, in the weeks that followed her departure, into a thorough and increasingly troubled review of the estate's accounts, driven as much by a nagging, unexamined guilt as by any specific suspicion, and the deeper he searched, the more the evidence began, slowly and undeniably, to point away from Eliza and toward the very man who had accused her. He interviewed tenants directly, something he had rarely troubled himself to do before Eliza's influence had taught him the value of listening to those who worked the land itself, and found, one by one, accounts that contradicted Harcourt's version of events in small but significant particulars. A tenant who recalled Harcourt himself dictating figures for a harvest report that bore little resemblance to what had actually been gathered that season, a stable hand who remembered strange visitors calling on Harcourt at odd hours, always departing quietly and without ceremony, a housemaid who had once glimpsed correspondence in Harcourt's own study bearing a family name that matched. Adrian now realized with a cold jolt the very intermediary buyers listed in the estate's suspiciously undervalued timber sales. He examined the forged documents themselves with rather more scrutiny than his initial, guilt-clouded review had permitted, and discovered, upon careful comparison, subtle but unmistakable inconsistencies in the handwriting, flourishes and letter formations that did not, in several key particulars, match Eliza's genuine correspondence, which he had, in the ordinary course of their working partnership, accumulated a considerable collection of over the preceding months. The full and uncomfortable truth settled over him with the particular, bitter clarity of a man forced to confront his own failure. Eliza had been telling the truth from the very beginning, not merely about the drainage channels and the spring, but about everything that had followed, every warning she had been too careful and too honest to voice without proof, every suspicion she had held privately rather than risk appearing to serve her own advantage. And he had believed a stranger's forged papers over the honesty of the woman who had stood beside him through every difficult month of the estate's recovery. Adrian summoned Harcourt to his study with an evidence file considerably more complete than the man could possibly have anticipated, and watched, with a cold satisfaction he did not particularly enjoy, as the estate manager's careful composure began, for the first time in Adrian's acquaintance with him, to crack. "I have spoken with your tenants, Harcourt. I have reviewed the timber accounts against the actual market prices for wood of that quality. I have compared the forged documents against Miss Bennet's genuine correspondence and found the discrepancies your forger failed to disguise completely. And I have found, in my grandfather's own old ledger, correspondence describing precisely this scheme, attempted by your own family a generation before you took up the effort yourself." Harcourt's face had gone pale, though he attempted, for a moment longer, to maintain some semblance of his usual composed dignity. "Your Grace, I assure you. Do not insult me further with denials, Harcourt. I have evidence enough to see you prosecuted for fraud, and I intend to use every particle of it unless you tell me, plainly and completely, the full extent of what you have done." The confession, once it finally came, unfolded with a bitterness that suggested years of carefully suppressed resentment finally given voice. Harcourt's family, it emerged, had served as Ashcombe's estate agents for 3 generations, watching successive dukes grow steadily wealthier from land that Harcourt's own family, through an accident of birth and circumstance, had never been permitted to own outright, however faithfully and skillfully they managed it on the family's behalf. When Adrian's father's mounting debts had finally created a genuine opportunity, Harcourt had simply continued and accelerated a scheme his own father and grandfather had begun in smaller, more cautious ways, deliberately allowing sections of the estate to decline, undervaluing its most productive resources, and steadily accumulating, through careful intermediary purchases, informal claims on the very land he had spent his career pretending to protect. "I did not create the debts that brought this estate to ruin, Your Grace," Harcourt said, with something approaching genuine bitterness now that the pretense had finally collapsed entirely. "Your father did that himself, quite thoroughly, long before I ever thought to take advantage of the opportunity his failures presented. I merely ensured that when Ashcombe finally fell, as it was always going to fall regardless of my involvement, my own family would finally receive some portion of what 3 generations of faithful service had never properly rewarded. That does not excuse what you did to Miss Bennet. Miss Bennet threatened everything I had spent a decade carefully arranging, Your Grace. I did what any desperate man might do, faced with the collapse of a plan he had invested his entire family's hopes in." Harcourt's composure had entirely abandoned him now, his voice rising with a bitterness he no longer troubled himself to disguise. "You cannot understand what it is to watch a family you have served faithfully for 3 generations grow fat on land your own grandfather helped protect and improve, while your own children inherit nothing but the privilege of continued service. I did what was necessary. I regret only that I was discovered before the scheme could be completed." "You regret nothing beyond your own failure, Harcourt, which tells me everything I need to know about the character of the man my family trusted for so many years." Adrian's voice remained cold, controlled, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "You will leave Ashcombe by morning. I will see that every particular of your scheme is made known to whatever future employer might otherwise consider engaging your services, and I will pursue whatever legal remedy the courts allow for the fraud you have committed against this estate and against an innocent woman's reputation." Adrian dismissed him that same afternoon, ordering a full and formal investigation into every particular of the scheme, and within the week, the forged documents against Eliza had been thoroughly exposed and publicly retracted, her name cleared before the same tenants who had briefly, uncertainly, doubted her. But clearing her name, Adrian understood grimly, would not by itself undo the hurt of having doubted her at all. Adrian rode to the Bennet farm himself the following morning, refusing Collins's offer to send a servant ahead with word of his coming, understanding, with a clarity that had cost him considerably to arrive at, that an apology delivered second-hand would carry none of the weight this particular failure required. He found Eliza in her father's modest kitchen garden, kneeling among the winter vegetables with the same unhurried competence he had first admired in her, months before, across the neglected fields of his own estate. She looked up at his approach with an expression that held more caution than welcome, and he could hardly blame her for it. "Your Grace." Her voice was carefully neutral. "I did not expect you here." I could not send this apology by letter, Eliza, nor through any servant's mouth but my own. He dismounted, standing before her with none of the practised composure that usually governed his bearing among his tenants. Harcourt has confessed everything. The forged documents, the timber scheme, the decade of deliberate neglect meant to force this estate toward ruin so his own family might finally claim it. Your name has been cleared before every tenant who briefly doubted it. I am glad to hear it, she said, though her tone remained guarded. Though I confess it does not entirely undo the wound of watching you believe a stranger's forged papers over everything I had shown you these past months. No, Adrian admitted. It does not. And I have no excuse to offer you that properly accounts for the failure, beyond the plain and unflattering truth that pride and old habit made me doubt my own judgment more readily than I ought to have doubted Harcourt's evident scheming. You believed a man's papers before you believed the woman who stood beside you when the land was dying, Eliza said quietly, and the words carried more hurt than accusation, which somehow made them land considerably harder. I do not say this to wound you further, Your Grace. I say it because it is true, and because I think you already know it as plainly as I do. You are entirely right, he said, without any attempt at defense. I failed you when it mattered most, and I do not know how a man properly earns back trust so completely broken. Perhaps, Eliza said, studying him a long moment, he begins by admitting the failure honestly, rather than explaining it away. Which you have, at least, managed to do. I did not come only to apologize, Adrian said, when the silence between them had stretched long enough that he understood some further honesty was required of him. Though the apology, I hope, matters a great deal. I came because I have spent these past weeks without you managing badly, Eliza, not merely the estate's affairs, though those have suffered considerably in your absence, but something considerably harder to explain in the language of ledgers and harvests. What do you mean, Your Grace? I mean that Ashcombe was dying when you arrived, and you taught me how to save it, the drainage, the rotation, the spring, all of it. I believed, for a long while, that this was the whole of what you had given me. But somewhere along the way, Eliza, you became the reason I wanted to save it at all. Not merely the land, though I have grown to love it considerably more than I ever expected, watching it recover under your guidance. Your honesty, your courage, the particular way you look at a struggling field and see not waste but possibility, when everyone else, myself very much included, had already given up on it entirely. Eliza said nothing for a long moment, though something in her carefully guarded expression softened, very slightly, at the plain sincerity of the admission. You are asking me to return to Ashcombe. I am asking you to return, yes. But not as an adviser, Eliza, and not because you saved my land, however true that remains. I am asking you to return as the woman I love, if you will still have me after everything I have failed to give you these past difficult weeks. He drew a breath, steadier than he expected. I know what such a match would mean for both of us, the talk it would create, the adjustment it would require of a world that does not easily forgive a duke marrying a tenant farmer's daughter. I find, having weighed all of it carefully, that I do not particularly care what London society makes of the choice. I care only whether you are willing to make it alongside me. And if I say I am afraid, Eliza said quietly, that once Ashcombe is fully restored, once the difficulty that first brought us together has passed entirely, you will find yourself drawn back toward the world you were born to, and I will simply have been useful for a season. Then I would tell you that the fear is understandable, given how thoroughly I failed you these past weeks. But I would also tell you that I have never, in the whole of my life, wanted anything as plainly and completely as I want you beside me, not as a solution to a problem, Eliza, but as the person who taught me what this land, and this life, could actually mean, once someone finally troubled themselves to look at it properly. Eliza returned to Ashcombe 2 days later, not as a servant summoned back to useful duty, nor as an adviser retained for her practical knowledge, but as the woman Adrian had publicly and unequivocally declared his intention to marry, whatever consequence the declaration might carry among the county's more traditionally minded families. The tenants received her return with a warmth that surprised even Adrian, who had underestimated, perhaps, how thoroughly her months of honest work among them had earned a loyalty considerably deeper than Harcourt's brief and ultimately unsuccessful campaign of doubt had managed to undermine. Thomas Bennet, watching his daughter ride toward the manor at the Duke's side, wept openly, and admitted, when Adrian sought his blessing formally some days later, that he had never truly believed a duke would take farming advice from a farmer's daughter, let alone offer her his hand in marriage, and that he was glad, more than he could properly express, to have been so thoroughly and happily proven wrong. The wedding, when it came that spring, was modest by the standards of aristocratic London, held in the small estate chapel rather than any grand cathedral, attended by tenants and farmers in considerably greater numbers than titled guests, the wedding breakfast featuring produce grown, quite deliberately, entirely from Ashcombe's own recovering fields and orchards. Several of Adrian's more fashionable London acquaintances declined to attend at all, unable to countenance a duke marrying so far beneath his station, and Adrian found, to his own quiet satisfaction, that he minded their absence considerably less than he might once have expected. "You do not regret it," Eliza said to him, some months into their marriage, watching him review the estate's accounts with an ease and confidence that would have seemed impossible, a year before, to the exhausted, defeated man who had once stood outside his own manor watching furniture carried away for sale. The talk, the disapproval, all of it. "I regret nothing, Eliza, beyond the weeks I lost to my own foolish doubt." He set down his pen, studying her with the particular warmth that had, over their months together, become entirely natural rather than remarkable. "I have gained, in exchange for whatever society's disapproval might cost me, an estate that no longer merely survives but genuinely flourishes, and a wife whose intelligence and courage I value considerably more than any title she lacked at birth. I find that a fair exchange by any reasonable accounting." The years that followed transformed Ashcombe more thoroughly than either of them, in their first hopeful test of 3 modest acres, could quite have imagined. The drainage system, fully restored across the whole of the western fields, ended the flooding and drought that had plagued the estate for a generation, and the crop rotation Eliza had learned from her father spread steadily across every productive acre, restoring soil that Harcourt's neglect had nearly exhausted entirely. The abandoned orchard, painstakingly pruned and replanted, began producing fruit in quantities sufficient not merely for the estate's own kitchens but for sale throughout the county, its rare old varieties, preserved, it turned out, quite deliberately by Adrian's protective grandfather, commanding prices considerably above the ordinary market rate. Even the manor itself, its leaking roof finally repaired and its neglected rooms slowly restored to comfortable habitability, seemed to Adrian, walking its corridors now, a house genuinely lived in rather than merely maintained against inevitable decline. Adrian established, at Eliza's careful urging, a small farming school on a portion of the estate's recovered land, where tenant families and neighbouring farmers alike could learn the improved methods that had transformed Ashcombe's fortunes so completely: proper drainage, careful rotation, the patient cultivation of orchards and livestock alike, ensuring that the knowledge which had saved his own estate might spread outward to benefit the wider community rather than remaining a private advantage. Jealously guarded. Thomas Bennet himself, in his later years, took considerable pride in teaching at the school his own daughter had helped establish, passing along to a new generation of farmers the knowledge he had once feared would go entirely unused for want of a son to receive it. Eliza involved herself deeply in the estate's ongoing management, respected by tenants and increasingly by the county's other landowners alike, not merely as the Duke's wife but as a genuine partner in Ashcombe's continued success, a woman whose practical wisdom, hard-won through years of honest labour rather than aristocratic education, proved considerably more valuable than the polished London manners she had never possessed and had never particularly wished to acquire. Neighbouring estates, watching Ashcombe's remarkable recovery with growing envy, began quietly seeking her counsel on their own struggling fields, and Eliza, remembering all too well what it meant to watch good land wasted for want of proper attention, never once turned such requests away. She was no longer spoken of, among the county's gossips, merely as the farmer's daughter who had married above her station. She had become, in her own right, the duchess whose knowledge had saved an entire estate from ruin, valuable not because the marriage had elevated her, but because her own intelligence and courage had been valuable long before any duke had troubled himself to recognize it. Several years later, on a warm summer evening much like the grey autumn morning when they had first spoken outside the manor, Adrian and Eliza stood together overlooking the very fields he had once planned to sell entirely. Where bare, cracked earth had once stretched toward a grey and indifferent sky, green wheat now moved in slow waves under a gentle wind, the recovered orchard beyond it heavy with ripening fruit, tenant cottages along the boundary freshly repaired and well tended, smoke rising peacefully from a dozen well-fed hearths. The old drainage channels, cleared and maintained now as a matter of routine estate care rather than desperate necessity, carried water exactly where the land required it, and the spring near the orchard, once hidden beneath years of neglect, now fed a small, well-tended pond where estate children swam on warm afternoons just like this one. Their 2 children ran ahead of them through the orchard's dappled shade, laughing, entirely unaware of how close this whole flourishing world had once come to being sold away to strangers before either of them had been born. "Do you remember," Adrian asked, watching the children chase each other between the old, rescued trees, "the day you told me I was selling land I never learned how to use?" "I remember it very well, Your Grace," Eliza said, smiling at the old formality, still used sometimes between them now as gentle affection rather than genuine distance. "You looked at me as though I had lost my senses entirely, addressing a duke in such terms. I very nearly had you removed from the property, if memory serves." "You very nearly did," she agreed, laughing softly at the memory now that its sting had long since faded into fondness. "I was rather more frightened than I let you see, standing there arguing with a duke about drainage channels I had no proof yet existed." "You were entirely right about the land," he said, taking her hand as they walked slowly toward the children's laughter. "But you were wrong about one thing, Eliza, that I have wanted to correct for some years now." "And what was that?" "You believed, that first day and for some while afterward, that the land itself was the most valuable thing at stake in all of this, the thing worth saving above everything else." He stopped, turning to face her fully, the fields spreading green and prosperous in every direction around them. "It was never the land that was worth saving most. It was the chance to become the sort of man who deserved land like this at all, and I would never have found that chance without you." Eliza said nothing further, only leaned into him as they walked, watching their children disappear and reappear between the fruit-heavy branches of an orchard that had once been abandoned entirely to rot, in fields that had once been dismissed as worthless by every man who ought to have known better. The evening settled gently over Ashcombe, gold light lengthening across land that had, against every early expectation, been given the chance to prove precisely what it was worth, and precisely who, given that chance himself, a failing duke might yet become.